So this one is on avatars and such. There's a blazing controversy over whether or not we live over and over again-ish. Now I'm going to present a lot of counter-arguments and some arguments for maybe this potential, but I hold it lightly and I hold it somewhat skeptically, but I also want to engage and live into the potential that that's a reality, as 27% of people in America think it is, and that's a Judeo-Christian culture, although simultaneously probably about 30% of them believe that Moses parted the Red Sea. So, I mean, maybe he did, but highly unlikely. IHMO. So, I'll give some scientific background maybe on some of these cases. Dr. Stevenson is considered sort of the head of these kinds of researching, really at the heart of it, especially in the West. His presentation is one of also skepticism, but he thinks that there's strong evidence that supports it, this theory, and at least that minimally there's something very, very strange going on here that our, typical science doesn't explain, because of the amount of cases that seem to be behind it. And even the American government has done numerous research studies on this, but have kept it, roughly in the black, so we don't know much about them. I'll maybe post some of those areas of research on maybe the bottom, somewhere down there. So in particular, Dr. Stevenson's research looked at cases like a young boy that, recalled numerous facts about a family living across in a nearby city, family members' names, like a particular stream that he would often go to. He would recall details of, many, many years previous of what happened, and then he brought the family over and showed him, where he lived and the family's name. Very peculiar. It could have been, for example, a child that came across this information in a book, or had somebody say to him this information at a very young age or something. It's possible. But then there are many other cases that are similar to this. Other cases that are peculiar are things like birthmark cases, where maybe a person was shot in the head, and then this person, or supposedly in the past life, and then they talk about how, this was the case, and their names and their family again, and again you can research it, and they research it, and they find out that indeed, this individual seems to have shot in the head. They had all the same family members. Abortion cases, usually they seem to cycle around trauma, something like a sudden violent death. And this is interesting in correlation to this sort of trauma incident. I had a Buddhist Lama, interestingly, tell me that in cases of trauma, there's this kind of psychic vortex that sort of hovers over the place where the trauma was. Take it or leave it. It was just an interesting idea. That was Lama Lodro. He fleshed it out in more detail, but it was roughly that. One way of looking at this non-metaphysically, which is something I've been exploring, which is post-metaphysics. It's in the Kantian line of reasoning, is to argue that indeed there's some sort of science that we don't have full knowledge of, and it would be probably revolving around something like Rupert Sheldrake's morphogenetic fields, and this connects deeply to things like Telsa's research, electromagnetism, That is to say, sort of the idea that, you know, this tree here, when it was in seed form, actually had sort of a energetic field that sort of programmed roughly the way it was going to grow. That's how, you know, that's how, according to Rupert Sheldrake, you know, we genetically grow. It's not, well, I mean, partly it's programmed into the sort of seed, but simultaneously the kind of pattern that it takes is some sort of energetic pattern that transcends the seed itself. And sort of it's stored in some sort of informational grid work that is transcendent of the physiological being-ish. Now I hold that again lightly, but let's play with that idea. Obviously, as far as developmental studies go, we know that young children do not have the capacity to be fully reasonable, and that means that they don't have the engagement with the conventional world, and therefore the ins and outs of what we consider to be conventional, and also simultaneously the ability to do sort of if-then reasoning. However, in cases of like past life incidents, potentially, there seems to be this kind of remembrance of what happened before. One way of looking at it through sort of the Rupert Sheldrake lens would be that these children are sort of tapping into a field of information that, you know, is sort of like the internet of mind, and they're pulling from it. And part of it seems to be the case that, you know, young children don't have the sort of, that programming actually kind of affects how we think about reality, and therefore the capabilities of what reality is. Now, often this in developmental studies is rightly called prerational, because they just don't have the ability to rationalize it, but they're in and out of these sort of state experiences that are non-normal, not normal to what our waking state would typically deem reality. And so this gives them potentially a capacity to see a reality that we're not typically experiencing, but then explain it sometimes through a lens that doesn't appear to be very clear to our rational minds. And that's personally, from a personal perspective, I remember speaking with my younger brother at about the age of 4, saying, "Do you remember before this? I remember before this, but I'm forgetting," or stuff like that. I don't remember why I said that, and this fits in quite nicely with developmental studies. It could just be a pre-rational mode of thinking, trying to sort of immortalize who I am as a being. Or it could be saying, you know, we forget things that don't seem to fit within our worldview. Piaget in his cognitive studies, for example, when he's pouring water into a beaker, one skinny beaker and one thick beaker, and then this, you know, the same amount of water is being poured into the two, but the child says, "No, there's more water in the thin beaker now because it, you know, goes up higher than the thick beaker." When they're showed that same video, you know, a couple years later, they'll deny that that's even them. They'll say that somebody doctored with the video. It's because it doesn't fit with their worldview, and therefore it must be denied. So when you grow developmentally, there's almost this requirement to deny inconsistencies within the worldview to help make sense of the world and fit in to the conventions of the world. And so with this sort of thing, it makes sense that we would deny it, in part because our conventional system says that, you know, this isn't the case. I mean, in Eastern cultures it's much more accepted. But again, this could be just some sort of subconscious, almost dreamlike reality that we're pulling up from our mind, and it could be explained quite nicely through scientific analyses. But nevertheless, what it's saying is that we want to tap into the subconscious to gain more access to our potentialities as humans, because in some form our mind seems to transcend the individual, even if there's no soul that's, you know, going from individual life to individual life. There's a deeper mental awareness that ought to be tapped into, roughly. Cheers.